16.5 million acre-feet. That is the number written into a piece of paper in 1922 that promised 7 states more water than the Colorado River has ever truly carried. And right now, 104 years later, that promise is falling apart in real time. Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir in the United States, sits at 1,041 feet above sea level tonight. That is 27% full, half a foot from the lowest point it has ever reached since it was first filled behind Hoover Dam in the 1930s. 300 miles upstream, Lake Powell, the second largest, sits at roughly 3,522 feet. That is 23% full and dropping toward a line where the dam above it can no longer make electricity for 5 million people. Together, the two reservoirs that hold nearly all of the Colorado River's stored water are at their lowest combined level since 1957, back when Lake Powell did not even exist yet, and Glen Canyon Dam was still under construction. There is no modern comparison for what is happening to this system right now, and on July 31st, 2026, 3 days ago, the federal government did something it has been trying to avoid for over a decade. It gave up waiting for the 7 states to agree and released its own plan to decide who gets less water, a plan that none of the states asked for, a plan that none of them are happy with, and a plan that still may not be enough to stop the 2 biggest reservoirs in America from hitting levels where the dams above them stop working altogether. My name is Simon. I cover water systems, infrastructure failures, and the geography stories behind the headlines. And this one has been building for a century. It starts with a number that was wrong from the day it was written down. In November of 1922, representatives from 7 western states gathered at a ranch outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. The meeting was led by Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, years before he became president and years before the dam that would carry his name was even started. The goal was straightforward. The Colorado River ran through or bordered 7 states, and all of them wanted its water. Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Hoover's job was to broker a deal that split the river fairly. The negotiators looked at the flow records they had. The gauging station at Lee's Ferry, Arizona, the dividing point between the upper and lower halves of the basin, had been measuring the river since 1906. The numbers looked generous. Average flows over those years ran around 16.4 million acre-feet per year. 1 acre-foot is roughly 326,000 gallons, enough to keep 2 average American homes running for a full year. Based on those numbers, the compact split 15 million acre-feet between the 2 halves of the basin, 7.5 million to the upper states and 7.5 million to the lower states. A separate treaty with Mexico in 1944 added another 1.5 million, bringing the total promise to 16.5 million acre-feet every year. It sounded like plenty. It was not. The flow records they used came from what turned out to be an unusually wet stretch of river history. Tree ring researchers, including teams at UCLA and the University of Arizona, later reconstructed Colorado River flows going back to the early 1500s by studying the width of annual growth rings in ancient trees across the basin. What they found upended the entire legal framework of the river. The real long-term average flow at Lee's Ferry was not 16.4 million acre-feet. It was closer to 12 to 13 million. The period the compact negotiators measured happened to capture some of the wettest decades the river had seen in centuries. They built an entire legal system for sharing a river on what amounted to a statistical fluke. The compact promised roughly 25 to 30% more water than the river has ever reliably carried. Some scientists at the time raised concerns. They warned that the data window was too short and too generous to base a permanent deal on. But the political momentum was too strong. 7 states had finally agreed on something, and nobody wanted to reopen negotiations with smaller, less comfortable numbers. So they signed it, they celebrated it, and they built an entire civilization on top of it. For decades, it did not matter that the math was wrong because the system had a savings account. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, filled during the early wet years, held enough stored water to cover the gap between what the states took out and what the river put in. The states were spending more than the river earned, but the account had cushion. That cushion is now nearly gone, and once a savings account approaches zero, every shortfall shows up immediately. Between late July 2025 and late July 2026, Lake Mead and Lake Powell lost a combined 3.04 million acre-feet of water. That is almost exactly the maximum single-year cut that the federal government's new plan even allows. The system is losing water at a pace that matches the deepest emergency reduction on the books, and the deepest emergency reduction has not even started yet. Lake Mead tells the physical story most clearly. If you drive out from Las Vegas on Highway 93 and look down into Black Canyon, the first thing your eye catches is a white line. It runs along both walls of the canyon, mile after mile, a bathtub ring of mineral stains left behind as the water pulled back from rock it once covered. That white ring now stretches roughly 180 feet above the current waterline. You can see it from the Las Vegas Strip on a clear day. It is likely the single largest visible scar left by a water crisis anywhere on Earth. At full pool, Lake Mead holds roughly 26 million acre-feet of water. The surface sits at 1,221 feet above sea level. As of July 31, 2026, the lake sits at 1,041 feet, holding just over 7 million acre-feet. It has lost nearly 3/4 of its water. The Bureau of Reclamation's July 2026 most probable forecast projects the lake will drop to 1,037 feet by the end of December. That would break the all-time record low of 1,040 feet set in July of 2022 by 3 feet. The reason the lake keeps falling even after 2 decent snow years earlier in the decade is the same reason it has been falling for a quarter century. More water leaves the system than enters it, and 2026 made that gap wider than it has ever been. The snowpack that was supposed to refill the system this spring was not there. Colorado recorded its worst snowpack in the history of its monitoring network. Statewide snow water equivalent on April 1st averaged just 3.1 inches, 22% of the 30-year median. The previous worst year on record, 2012, had 9.1 inches. This year had roughly a third of that. Of 64 snow measurement sites with at least 50 years of data, 60 recorded their lowest readings ever. Colorado's 130 automated SNOTEL monitoring stations had been reading at the 0th percentile since January 15th. That means the snowpack was lower than every single previous year in the entire period of record, not bottom 10%, below everything ever measured. Peak snowpack across the state hit on March 9th, nearly a full month ahead of the normal early April peak. Then a record-shattering heat wave arrived. Colorado recorded its warmest March in 132 years of tracking. The Colorado River Basin as a whole experienced its warmest March on record, running 13.7 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. Burlington, at the Kansas border, hit 99 degrees on March 25th, breaking the state's all-time March high. The heat did not just slow snow accumulation. It actively destroyed what little snowpack remained, melting it weeks before the rivers were supposed to carry it downstream. And here is the detail that separates 2026 from every previous bad year. Colorado's total moisture through January was actually 89% of normal, close to average. The precipitation came, it just did not come as snow. The record warmth turned it into rain, particularly below 8,000 ft. Water hit the ground and either evaporated or soaked into parched soil rather than building the frozen reservoir that the entire downstream system depends on. A dry year is a setback. A warm year that turns snow into rain is a pattern shift. And that pattern shift is exactly what climate scientists have been warning about for decades. The collapse was not limited to Colorado. Southeastern Utah recorded just 22% of average stored snow water, the worst in its region. The Animas and San Juan headwaters, which feed directly into Lake Powell, sat in the mid-40s% of normal. NASA satellite images showed snow-covered area across the entire upper basin at roughly 40% of typical early March coverage, the lowest since satellite tracking began in 2001. Arizona and New Mexico set new record-low April 1st snow water values. 8 western states broke their all-time records that same day. Spring runoff into Lake Powell, the seasonal pulse of snowmelt that normally refills the system between April and July, was forecast at just 17% of normal. Total water year inflow to Lake Powell came in at 36% of the 30-year average. The river that feeds 40 million people received roughly a third of what it normally carries. The drought driving these numbers is not a weather event. Research published in the journal Nature Climate Change by UCLA climate hydrologist Park Williams found that the mega drought gripping the southwestern United States since the year 2000 is the driest period in at least 1,200 years. Williams and his team used tree ring records covering the last 12 centuries to track soil moisture across the region, going back further than the founding of Oxford, further than the Norman invasion of England. No 22-year stretch in that entire span matched the severity of what the American West has experienced since the turn of the century. And the study calculated that 42% of this megadrought's severity is directly attributable to human-caused climate change. Without those emissions, the drought would likely have ended around 2005. Instead, it is now in its 26th year. So the river was overpromised from the start, and it is now running through the worst dry stretch in over a millennium. And 40 million people have built their cities, their farms, their power grids, and their entire way of life on top of it. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. I cover water crises, infrastructure, and geography events like this as they develop, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is happening. Now, the engineering inside the two dams is where the crisis shifts from a water problem to a power problem. Hoover Dam was finished in 1935. It stands 726 feet from base to crest, 660 feet thick at the base, built from enough concrete to pave a two-lane highway from San Francisco to New York. It was the largest concrete structure on the planet when it was completed, and it remains one of the most productive hydroelectric facilities in the western United States. The dam holds 17 main turbines and at full pool can generate roughly 2,080 megawatts, enough electricity to power about 1.3 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. But hydropower runs on pressure. The higher the lake, the harder water pushes down through the intake towers and slams into the turbines at the base. Every foot of lost lake height cuts the force driving those turbines. Power generation in 2023 was roughly half the output of the year 2000, the last time Lake Mead was effectively full. At the current elevation of 1,041 feet, the dam is already producing well below its designed capacity. The Bureau of Reclamation estimates output has dropped roughly 30% from historical levels. The real engineering danger sits at 1,035 feet. At that elevation, 12 of the dam's 17 turbines face a destructive process called cavitation. The water pressure drops so low that vapor bubbles form inside the turbine housings and then collapse violently against the metal blades, tearing the equipment apart from the inside. Those 12 older turbines must shut down to prevent permanent damage. That leaves 5 newer widehead units installed a decade ago at a cost of $42 million specifically for low water conditions. Those 5 can operate down to 950 feet, but they generate only about 382 megawatts, an 82% drop from full power. Lake Mead sits just 6 feet above that shutdown line tonight. In May of 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation announced $52 million in upgrades to replace up to 3 of those older turbines with newer widehead units, which would restore an estimated 160 megawatts of capacity. The money came from the Hoover Dam Post-Retirement Benefit Fund, freed by the Help Hoover Dam Act that Congress passed in February of 2026. It is a start, but the dam needs an estimated $200 million in total upgrades over the next decade, and replacing all 12 older turbines would cost $156 million. The money announced so far covers roughly a quarter of the full need. 300 miles upstream, Glen Canyon Dam faces an even more immediate crisis. Lake Powell currently sits at roughly 3,522 feet, just 32 feet above the 3,490 feet minimum power pool, the level at which the dam's 8 turbines lose submergence and can no longer generate electricity. Those turbines power roughly 5 million people across 6 states. The Bureau of Reclamation's July 2026 projections show the lake could breach that minimum power line as soon as March of 2027. Lake Powell is receiving just 2% of its average monthly inflow right now. In July alone, the reservoir received a fraction of what it normally gets during what is supposed to be the tail end of spring runoff season. To buy time, the Bureau of Reclamation ordered emergency releases from Flaming Gorge Reservoir in Wyoming, more than 400 miles upstream, sending up to 1 million acre-feet of water downstream to prop up Lake Powell. Federal managers also cut the amount of water Powell sends downstream to Lake Mead. But even with those emergency measures, the water level barely budged. The extra water did little to reverse the trend. And if the lake drops below minimum power pool, water can only leave through the dam's 4 river outlet works, a set of bypass pipes that were never designed to carry the full flow of the Colorado River for months at a time. During a 2023 emergency release, inspectors found cavitation damage inside those bypass pipes after just 72 hours of sustained use. The backup system for the backup system showed signs of failure in 3 days. The Bureau of Reclamation considers those pipes safe for extended operation only down to about 3,394 feet. Below that, even the ability to release water downstream becomes uncertain. Dead pool at Glen Canyon Dam sits at 3,370 feet. At that level, roughly 240 ft of water would be trapped at the bottom of the canyon, unable to flow past the dam by gravity. Everything downstream loses its supply. If both Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam lose the ability to generate power within months of each other, a scenario that is now on the forecast charts for late 2026 or early 2027, the Western power grid loses 2 of its largest hydroelectric facilities simultaneously. That has never happened in the history of the Colorado River system. Below the dam's power problems is the water supply itself. Las Vegas gets roughly 90% of its drinking water from Lake Mead through the Colorado River. That is 2.3 million residents and 43 million yearly visitors relying on a single source. The city's original intake pipes were built for a lake that stays above 1,050 feet. When the lake dropped below that level, the first intake became useless. A second intake, at roughly 1,000 feet, still works, but grows more vulnerable with every foot the lake drops. The fix that saved Las Vegas was built by the Southern Nevada Water Authority under the leadership of Pat Mulroy, who ran the authority for over 2 decades. It is called the Third Straw. A 3-mile-long tunnel drilled through solid rock beneath the floor of Lake Mead, connecting an underwater intake at roughly 860 feet to pumping and treatment plants onshore. The tunnel is 20 to 24 feet across. Construction began in 2008 and took 7 years through brutal conditions, including repeated groundwater floods that swamped the tunnel boring machine. The project cost $817 million. A second project, the Low Lake Level Pumping Station, came online in 2020 and began full operation in April 2022, adding pumping power down to 875 mints at an additional cost of $52 million. Total cost, nearly $1.5 billion for a system that can pull water from a lake even if that lake drops below the point where gravity can push it through the dam. That system became needed years ahead of anyone's worst-case timeline. Nevada's legal share of the Colorado River is just 300,000 acre-feet per year, the smallest allotment of any basin state at 1.8% of total flows. You would think that combination, the smallest share and the biggest exposure, would make Las Vegas the city most at risk. Instead, it may be the most prepared city on the entire river system. Per-person water use has dropped 55% since 2002, even as the metro area added over 800,000 people. The city recycles 85% of its wastewater, the highest rate of any Colorado River Basin state. Every shower, every faucet, every hotel room on the Strip, all of that indoor water gets treated, cleaned, and returned to the lake. Las Vegas built the tunnel, cut demand in half, and recycled nearly everything, and the lake is still falling. That is what makes the rest of this story so difficult, because the third straw only helps one city. The rest of the basin has no such backup. In Pinal County, Arizona, about an hour south of Phoenix, farming families have watched their water disappear. The Central Arizona Project Canal carries Colorado River water 336 miles across open desert to reach central and southern Arizona. When the federal government declared a shortage, Pinal County's farmers were among the first to lose their supply. They held some of the lowest priority water rights in the state. Fields that had grown cotton, alfalfa, and grain for decades went dry. Hundreds of acres of cracked brown earth now sit where green rows used to be. An estimated 40% of roughly 200 farms in the county are following their land this year, leaving fields unplanted for the first time in their family's histories on that ground. Cotton farmer Rodney Shedd and his wife Tiffany are among them. Their water share has been cut again and again since the first shortage tier kicked in, and this year the numbers finally made planting impossible. Land that was green last spring sits brown and dusty this summer. The Ak-Chin Indian community, a tribal nation in Pinal County that has depended on irrigated farming for centuries, has watched its water supply shrink as well. For a community that spent decades fighting in courts and in Congress just to secure its water rights, watching those rights dry up in a shortage it did not cause carries a weight that reaches far beyond farming income. It is a broken promise stacked on top of a very long history of broken promises. The Imperial Valley in Southern California sits in the Sonoran Desert just north of the Mexican border. It gets almost zero rain, but it uses Colorado River water to irrigate roughly 700,000 acres of farmland. That land grows about 2/3 of America's winter vegetables. The lettuce in your grocery store in January, the broccoli on your plate in February, the carrots in your bag in March. Much of it comes from desert dirt watered by a river that is running out. If water to the Imperial Valley takes a significant cut, you do not just lose California farmland. You lose vegetables from grocery shelves in Ohio, Georgia, and Maine. A water crisis in the desert Southwest becomes a food price crisis across the entire country. And then there is what happened 3 days ago. On July 31st, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation released its final environmental impact statement for post-2026 Colorado River operations. This is the document that replaces every existing deal, guideline, and drought plan that has governed the river since 2007. All of those agreements expire at the end of this year. The 7 states were supposed to negotiate new rules among themselves. They failed. They missed a deadline in November of 2025. They missed another on February 14th of 2026. They walked away from a summit in Las Vegas in December of 2025 with nothing to show for it. They left a meeting in February, trading blame in press statements the same afternoon. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum convened a meeting of all 7 governors on January 30th, 2026. California sent stand-ins instead of the governor showing up in person. So the federal government stepped in and made the decision for them. The plan sets a flexible 10-year framework through 2036. It establishes what the Bureau calls an adaptive decision framework, meaning the rules can be adjusted every 2 years based on how much water the river actually carries. The framework allows lower basin shortages of up to 3 million acre-feet per year. That is roughly 40% of the lower basin's legal entitlement. Under the plan, if the lower basin faced a shortage of 1.5 million acre-feet, Arizona would give up 760,000 acre-feet, California would give up 440,000 acre-feet, Nevada would give up 50,000 acre-feet, and Mexico would absorb 250,000. Arizona carries the heaviest burden. It absorbs 80% of the first 300,000 acre-feet of shortage. California, holding the most senior water rights in the basin, is shielded when shortages are smaller and faces no forced reductions until deeper tiers kick in. That built-in advantage has made California the quietest state in every negotiating room and the most resented by every other state at the table. The upper basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, are spared from mandatory cuts under this plan, at least for now. But they are asked to conserve up to 200,000 acre-feet voluntarily. Colorado's water commissioner Becky Mitchell has argued that the upper basin has never used its full share. They use roughly 4.5 million acre-feet per year against a paper entitlement of 7.5 million. Mitchell's position is that the upper basin should not be forced to solve a problem it did not create with water it does not have. Nobody is happy with the plan. Arizona's Tom Bushatsky, the director of the state's Department of Water Resources, has spent years sitting across negotiating tables from the upper basin, and his patience has run out. Arizona has already committed to saving 1.5 million acre-feet per year and has been demanding that the upper basin accept forced reductions of its own. Arizona has hired outside legal counsel and sharply increased its legal budget. If the framework holds in a form Arizona considers unfair, the fight moves to federal court. The Upper Colorado River Commission issued a statement saying operations must shift away from a demand-based framework and instead reflect what the river actually provides. The governors of Arizona, California, and Nevada released a joint statement noting that their 3 states account for approximately 75% of the population, employment, and agricultural production of the entire basin, plus 25 of the 30 tribal nations within it. And here is a fact that captures the absurdity of the entire situation better than any number. The Colorado River, the river that carved the Grand Canyon over 6 million years, no longer reaches the ocean. For most of the last quarter century, the river dries up somewhere in the Sonoran Desert south of the United States-Mexico border, miles and miles before it would reach the Sea of Cortez. The river mouth that once spread across vast wetlands, home to jaguars, cottonwood forests, and native fishing communities, is now mostly dry mud, cracked earth, and salt flats. The Cocopah people, whose name translates to river people, fished and farmed the river's delta for centuries. Today, the river that defined their identity barely trickles into their land. A river with enough force to carve a canyon a mile deep and 277 miles long cannot finish its own trip to the sea. That should tell you everything about how far the math has drifted from reality. The wider picture is what makes this a national story rather than a Western one. The Colorado River does not just water lawns in Las Vegas and fill swimming pools in Scottsdale. It supports 5.5 million acres of farmland. It generates more than 8 billion kilowatt-hours of hydroelectric power annually, enough for roughly 700,000 homes. It provides municipal water to nearly 40 million people across 7 states and northern Mexico. When this system fails, it does not fail locally. It fails across supply chains, power grids, and food markets that reach every state in the country. And there is one more number that should sit with you. The Bureau of Reclamation projects that Lake Mead could fall to 1,037 feet by the end of this year. Lake Powell's most probable forecast shows it dropping toward minimum power pool by spring. If both reservoirs breach their critical lines within months of each other, the 2 largest dams on the Colorado River lose the ability to generate electricity at roughly the same time. That has never happened. Sarah Porter, director of the Keel Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, described the situation directly. The low reservoir levels are a signal that the system is at risk of crashing, meaning levels so low that water cannot be delivered from the reservoirs at all. The word she used was crashing, not struggling, not declining, crashing. The 1922 compact was built on wet year data. The 2007 guidelines that replaced it were supposed to be temporary. The 2019 drought plans that followed were supposed to buy time. All of them expire in less than 5 months. The federal government has now released its own framework, and every state at the table has already signaled that it will fight for a different version. The legal challenges could take years, and during every one of those years in court, the river keeps responding to the same inputs it always has. Snowpack, temperature, evaporation, all 3 are pushing in the same direction. Lake Mead sits at 1,041 feet tonight, half a foot from the lowest point it has ever been. The white ring on the canyon walls stretches 180 feet above the waterline and keeps climbing. Lake Powell sits at 30,522 feet, 32 feet above the line where its turbines go dark. The combined storage of both reservoirs has not been this low since before most of the people who depend on them were born. The federal plan is on the table. The states are already pushing back. The courts are loading. And somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, at monitoring stations that should be buried in snow, the readings are still coming back at 0. The compact promised 16.5 million acre-feet. The river carries 12. The difference between those 2 numbers is the gap that 104 years of politics, engineering, and wishful thinking have failed to close. And the gap is still growing. If you want to see what happens when the October deadline hits and the states have to live under rules they did not choose, subscribe. This story is not close to over.